بسم الله بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا ومولانا محمد وبارك وسلم. اللهم ربنا أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه. اللهم أرنا حقائق الأشياء كما هي، ربنا زدنا علما وعملا وإخلاصا يا رب العالمين. اللهم انصر أوليائك في مشارق الأرض ومغاربها، اللهم انصرهم على عدوك وعدوهم إنك على كل شيء قدير. اللهم فرج عنا وعن إخواننا في مشارق الأرض ومغاربها، اللهم نفس كربنا وكربهم وثبت أقدامنا واقطعهم والطف بنا وبهم يا أرحم الراحمين يا رب العالمين. وصل وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وأزواجه وذريته أجمعين برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. Okay, so we're reading Professor Hans Why Revolution is No Longer Possible Today. And we had covered this paragraph, but we'll go through it again. So, why is neoliberal system of rule so stable? Probably he means why there's no, so a system can be stable in itself, inherently stable. Stable system, internally stable system can be overthrown as well. Maybe because their alternatives are more powerful. But why is neoliberal system rule so stable? It's very stable. So it can be stable because there's no alternative to it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's stable in itself. I mean, we know that neoliberal system, especially financial system, is very unstable. But people might argue that volatility is part and parcel of its overall stability and so forth. Why is there so little opposition to it? So the opposition to capitalism can be of two types. Opposition to capitalism can be of two types. Internal opposition and external opposition. So, for example, Marxism is, I would regard it as internal opposition because Marxism agrees with capitalism on the basic need for the divinity of humanity and the basic need to overcome scarcity and commitment to accumulation for the sake of accumulation. What Marxism argues that liberal or neoliberal political system and economic systems actually waste this potential, the huge potential which is created by capitalism. So that's the internal opposition. But then you can have external opposition. External opposition, like for example, Islamic position or Orthodox Christian position. Orthodox, by Orthodox I don't mean Orthodox in the narrow sense, but Orthodox in the Christian position before modernity, for example, before it succumbed to modernity. Islam and Christianity both reject the idea of human divinity, or obviously Christianity doesn't reject it wholeheartedly, because at least it thinks that there was one human being who was also a god. And that's basically what paved the way for this whole idea of the deification of human being to a certain extent. But Islam obviously totally rejects any idea of human deification. And both Islam and Christianity also reject the ideal of accumulation for the sake of accumulation, and regard it as a satanic, devilish, a demonic ideal. Accumulation for the sake of accumulation, the ideal, which basically is the idea of creating a kingdom of ends in this world, which will never which will last forever, for example, al-mulku la yabla. And the commitment to human divinity is a devilish, because it's basically a divinity of devil itself, really. Yeah, so the opposition capitalism can be internal as well as external, and he doesn't seem to make this distinction here, not so far anyway. Why is there so little opposition to it? So when he talks about why there's little opposition to it, I guess in theory he's talking about both internal and external opposition. I mean, there is internal opposition, but obviously Marxism was defeated, at least in Soviet Union and China. I mean, in China it wasn't defeated, but it reformed itself. So why is there so little opposition, or at least opposition which is strong enough? And obviously, I don't know what's his answer to it, but at least he goes back to what Marcuse said about Marcuse, Marx, and in his One-Dimensional Man and other books. And what I had, obviously I haven't read Marcuse for a long time, but what I had learned from him, I mean, I had understood from him, was that the idea that capitalism has the power to incorporate its opposition through providing them with a place under the sun, so to speak. So, for example, the union movement was focused on labor rights. So, by providing, for example, by providing welfare rights, capitalism actually incorporated those potentially system um, resisting movement or system, potentially movements which were aimed against the system and made them into part and parcel of the system. So I think that's sort of, it seems like this Professor Hahn's article is in the same genre as Marcuse's One-Dimensional Man and other writings. But we'll see. So why does all opposition so swiftly go nowhere? Let's especially internal opposition, especially the opposition at the heart, in the heartland of capitalism, as capitalism is mature. For example, in Europe, in Europe, in China, in Russia, etc. Russia, etc. To a certain extent. Let's speculate about it a bit. So why does all opposition so why does all opposition so swiftly go nowhere? So swiftly go nowhere. What does that mean? I mean, like, it doesn't go anywhere. It's not successful. At least after the collapse of Soviet Union and all that. And one reason might be, if it is true, and to a certain extent, at least in the first world, it is true, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when there is no alternative became a mantra of the intellectual and political elites. So as a system is overwhelming, it has defeated all opposition. So in that sense, the alternatives sort of wither away, even from the horizon of possibility. And one reason within capitalism is that because capitalism is basically about fulfilling desires. And creating an individuality in a society which is committed to and see it legitimate to commit itself to this pursuit of maximizing desires, maximizing the fulfillment of these desires. And the individuality which pursues desires increasingly become incapable of sacrificing itself and its possession for something higher, I think. And if this is the case, if the whole opposition is based on fulfillment of desires, and the whole conflict is about who is able to fulfill desires more, the system as well as the opposition to it is both hung in the same orbit, in the sense that the individuality of the same type is the type which is committed to fulfilling desire, and the individuality which commits itself to fulfilling desire increasingly become incapable of making sacrifices. And if you can't make sacrifice, then you can't really commit yourself to any revolution, because revolution requires huge sacrifices at the individual as well as social level. So in a sense, capitalism, as it permeates a society, makes it impossible or less likely for people to be able to sacrifice. And the greatest sacrifice is sacrificing your life. And revolution often requires the sacrifice of your life, or at least your life as a free and comfortable life. You might be threatened by imprisonment, torture. So, and to the extent that sacrifices are made within, sacrifices are made within capitalist oppositions. They are nationalist of nature, because in nationalism you have something that you sacrifice for your higher self. So you might not be able to fulfill your desire, but you will fulfill your desire in your larger self, which is the nation. So in a sense, you collapse yourself into a higher self. Larger self, not necessarily higher in quality. So in a sense, the success of capitalism also means that resistance to it become less likely. So that's why those who aim to resist capitalism or struggle against capitalism, it's important for them to abandon the reshape or recreate a personality whose fundamental goal is not the fulfillment of desire but something else. Okay, let's go back. So to the extent that why does all of this necessarily go nowhere, that might be the reason. Okay, why is revolution no longer possible despite the ever greater gap between the rich and the poor? So the whole question hangs around the gap and whose desires are being fulfilled and to what extent. But the thing is, if that's all you're looking after, or that's all that you are struggling for, like lifting poor people's life, or bridging the gap between the rich and the poor, then I think you are going to find that it is increasingly impossible to mobilize people against the system on this basis, and I'll tell you why. You might be able to mobilize it, but if you want people to make sacrifices on a sustained basis, that won't work, and here's why. The gap between the rich and the poor in mature capitalism, that's increasing. But there is still a room or always opportunities for a lot of people, a large number of people, for upward mobilization through education, through working hard, etc. So it's not just poor and rich, but there's a middle in between. And for any system, if there is enough number which are, up here, so if you are committed to fulfilling your desires, and if a critical mass of population thinks that they are either fulfilling their desire to a certain extent, or if they work harder they can fulfill them, if they have that hope, and if they are incapable of making sacrifice to the extent, then just the gap between rich and poor is not going to unsettle the system on its own. And very poor are not going to make revolution. They can hardly, stand on their feet. It's people here that make revolutions. And if they are committed to this pursuit in one way or another, and they think that they have a possibility of upward mobilization, upward mobility in relative terms, if the critical mass of people think that they have that opportunity, even if that opportunity is not as fantastic as it used to be, you are not going to be able to agitate people against a system, especially when it involves making sacrifices on the basis of making their life better, for example. These are the answers which I gave speculatively. Now he is going to give his own answer. An explanation required first for to understand how power and the rule function today. Okay, but probably we'll see that. We'll get to that in the next section, inshallah. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك وصلي وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله سيدنا محمد وبارك وسلم صلى عليه. سبحان ربنا ربك العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين.